Today, we are going to talk about something that is absolutely crucial for anyone trying to build a case for, well, for anything really. Whether you're working on a research paper, a business proposal, or even just a creative project. We're going to uncover the secret ingredient that turns a bunch of pretty good ideas into one single, powerful, and totally convincing argument. Let's break down how to get it right. Have you ever had this happen? You've put in the hours, you've gathered all your evidence, and you just know your idea is brilliant. But then, when you present it, it just lands with a thud. It doesn't persuade people the way you thought it would. And that is so frustrating. So what's the deal? What's going wrong? Well, the problem, more often than not, is this hidden little villain I like to call misfit. Misfit is what happens when all the different parts of your project, your big question, your data, your analysis, and your conclusion, don't really talk to each other. It's like you're trying to build a puzzle with pieces from 5 different boxes. They just don't fit together. So if misfit is our villain, then the hero of our story is something called internal coherence. I want you to think about it like a perfectly designed piece of architecture. Every single beam, every wire, every joint is perfectly aligned and supports the whole structure. When your project has that kind of internal coherence, every part logically flows into the next, creating an argument that's solid, stable, and just incredibly persuasive. Okay, so how do we actually build this coherent structure? Well, we're going to use this 5-point coherence check as our blueprint. This little model shows us the 5 critical connections that absolutely must hold strong for your argument to stand up. We're going to walk through each one step by step. Let's start right at the foundation, okay? The first and maybe the most critical connection is between the question you're asking and the data, the evidence you're using to answer it. Now, this sounds super obvious, I know, but you would be shocked at how often this is the exact spot where a project starts to crack. This right here is a classic example of that mistake. Let's say you want to study those little unconscious habits people have every day. Well, watching them or using video recordings, that's a great fit. But if your only tool is interviews, you've created a misfit. And why is that? It's because most of us are actually pretty terrible at explaining the things we do automatically. The data you're collecting just doesn't fit the question you're asking. All right, moving on to our second checkpoint. This one's all about the scope of your question. See, to make a real contribution, your question can't be gigantic, but it can't be tiny either. It has to hit that perfect sweet spot. This is the perfect way to think about it, the Goldilocks principle. You remember the story, right? A question like, how do organizations deal with competing logics, is way too broad. It's like trying to boil the entire ocean. But then a question about one niche supplier in one specific place, well, that's too narrow to really matter to anyone else. The just right question focuses the whole thing, in this case on leadership styles, making it specific enough that you can actually answer it, but broad enough to be interesting. Now for connection number 3. So, you've got the right data for your question. Awesome. But now you have to explain what you did with that data. This is all about the fit between your analysis and your evidence. And really, it's about being authentic about your process. Does this look familiar to you? Yeah, we see this kind of generic cookie-cutter description of analysis all the time. The problem is it tells us almost nothing. It completely hides the real, messy, interesting work of discovery and makes it sound like this sterile, step-by-step process. That doesn't build trust with your audience. It just makes them suspicious. So the key here is just to be authentic. Show your work. Talk about the real journey, the dead ends you hit, and especially those aha moments where your thinking totally shifted. You have to explain how you made that leap from just raw data to a bigger idea. That is what builds authority and makes your audience really trust your conclusions. We're getting close to the end now. Checkpoint number 4 is all about making sure there's a clear, unbroken chain of logic leading from your messy, authentic analysis straight to your final findings. Your reader has to be able to follow your path from point A to point B to point C. And here are some of the classic ways that chain of logic can just snap. You might use inconsistent labels for the same idea, which is super confusing. Or you get a little too excited and make these huge claims in your conclusion that your data doesn't really back up. But I think the biggest trap of all is the curse of knowledge. You've lived with this stuff for months, right? You have to remember your audience is seeing it for the very first time. You gotta guide them by the hand. And that brings us to the 5th and final checkpoint. This is where we bring it all home, where we bring everything full circle. Does the end of your argument actually fulfill the promise you made at the very beginning? A surprisingly common failure is what's called the broken loop. A project might start by asking this really fascinating question, but by the time you get to the conclusion, it ends up answering a slightly different question, or it just doesn't fully solve the original puzzle. And that leaves the audience feeling, well, a little cheated. You have to close the loop that you opened. Okay, so we've walked through our whole 5 points coherence check. But, this is about more than just passing some test or avoiding criticism from a reviewer. Achieving this kind of deep fit has a much, much bigger payoff. When your project is truly coherent, it just radiates authority. It feels solid, robust, and carefully crafted. It shows authenticity, it reflects a genuine journey of discovery. But most importantly, it creates trustworthiness. Your audience is convinced not just because you tell them to be, but because they can see for themselves how every single piece fits together perfectly to support the whole. So as we wrap up, I'm just going to leave you with this one question to think about with your own work. Take a hard look at what you're building. Is it a truly coherent whole where every element supports all the others? Or is it just a collection of interesting but ultimately disconnected parts? Getting that fit right is literally the difference between a weak argument and one that can truly change minds. So apply this check and make your next big idea undeniable.